Let's start with the favorites. I want to make sure that when I'm in a recipe, I can click that star and that adds this as a favorite and shows it here in the favorite screen, where I currently see nothing because I removed these dummy favorites. For that, I'll start in the store folder in the actions folder and add a new file there, which I'll also name meals.js. You can name it differently if that's confusing to you, but we get these two files, meals.js here in actions and meals.js in reducers. And in the actions meals.js file, I will set up some Redux actions, which typically starts by setting up some unique identifiers, which I store in constants. And that will be toggle favorite. You can use whatever you want here. The value you store here typically is the same identifier. So this is the identifier value, and that is simply stored in a constant so that we don't have to manually type this later, but we can always import this constant and avoid typos. Again, if that's brand new to you, definitely check out a dedicated React Redux resource first. Now I'll also use the action creator pattern here, which means I have that identifier here, but now I will also export a function that creates me an action, because an action is not just an identifier often, and in this case that's the case, it also needs some extra payload, and therefore we actually have an action which is an object with identifier and payload. And therefore here I'll add a function that creates me such an action object, and I'll name this toggle favorite like this, so like the identifier but in camel case. And this is a function that can receive some data because I will be the one calling it. And that should return a JavaScript object which describes this action. So which has, let's say, a type. That's typically how you call that identifier field, but you're generally free to use whatever you want there. And in my case, it will be toggle favorite. So I point at this identifier. I use this string as an identifier. And then any extra data you want. For example, here, I'll need to add the meal ID of the meal, which should be toggled. And that means that this function also needs to get this ID as an input, because otherwise I can't store it in the action which I create. So this is my action creator for the toggle favorite action. Now in the reducer, I want to act when I get such a toggle favorite action. And for this, I'll use a pattern which you probably have seen if you worked with Redux before. I'll use a switch statement here and switch on my action type, because keep in mind that action will be an object with a type property which identifies the action that occurred. So I switch on that action type, and then I handle different cases for the different actions I might have. So here I have the toggle favorite action. For this, you need to import toggle favorite from actions meals. And that's why I'm storing this in the separate constant, because now I don't have to manually type toggle favorites where I might have a typo in there. Instead, I just use that constant in which the string is stored. And now here, I run whichever logic I want to run to then work with that action and change my state such that the meal with the meal ID that's part of my action is added to favorite meals or removed from there if it already was part, because it's a toggle action here. I want to add items that aren't favorites yet. I want to remove items that are. Side note, in the switch statement, I also will add a default case where I just return the unchanged state. We shouldn't really reach that, but in case we do, well, then that's what we do. But back to the toggle favorite case. In there, I now want to, in the end, find out whether my meal with the ID that's part of the action, because I'm adding the meal ID to the action, if that meal is already part of favorite meals. If yes, I want to remove it. If it's not, I want to add it. So for this, I'll start by finding the index of the meal in the favorite meals array, because if that is then -1, I know I didn't find the index, so it wasn't part. If that's greater or equal than 0, I know that the item was part of that. So I'll have my existing index here, and I get this by using state favorite meals. Whoops, and there I need the equal sign. And state is simply my current state snapshot, which I get, and there we'll have a favorite meals property. And I can use the find index method, a normal JavaScript method, which I can use on arrays, to get the index of an item that matches a certain criteria, which I set up here in a function I pass to find index. This function runs on every meal in the array. And if it returns true, then it gives me the index of the element for which it ran true. So here, I want to return true if meal.id is equal to action.mealid. That simply means that the meal I'm looking at in my favorite meals has the same ID as the meal for which this action occurs, and that means if that is true for any item in favorite meals, that the meal we're trying to toggle is already part of the favorites, so we'll have to remove it because this will now return us the index of the item, therefore existing index will be greater than -1, and therefore we can then use that index to remove it. If this returns true for no item, so if this in the end returns -1, I know that the item isn't part of favorite meals yet. So existing index holds very important information, and hence I will use it here in the if statement and check if existing index is greater or equal than 0, which means we already have that meal as part of the favorite meals, or not. Now in the if case, so the item already is part of the favorite meals, I want to remove it. So here I will in the end return a new state, because in your reducer in the end you have to return a new state, which is a new object where I first of all copy the existing state with the spread operator here to pull out all the key value pairs of the existing state so that I don't lose any state and don't overwrite any state I don't want to overwrite. And then I will only overwrite the favorite meals, so I'll add this property again to overwrite the existing favorite meals with my new favorite meals, which should in the end be the old favorite meals without the item on this index. And now here to get my updated favorite meals, I'll create a new constant, updated fav meals. There I will first of all create a new array and populate it with my existing meals. So with my existing favorite meals like this. And I do this to create a copy of that array so that I don't manipulate the original array if I now start working on that. Because now I want to take my updated fav meals, call splice here, and then remove the item at the existing index and only that item. So this will in the end take this updated fav meals index, edit it and remove the item at this index and edit this array. That's why I copied it so that I don't edit the original array. And now we can use this updated fav meals array here and store this back as favorite meals into our store, because that will be the favorite meals array without the meal we just removed. In the else case, which is of course relevant if we're not finding a product, so we want to add it, here I also want to return a new state where I first of all copy the old state, and then I will override favorite meals to basically be my old favorite meals. And now I can call concat, a JavaScript method built into, well, JavaScript, which returns a new array, which takes the old array and adds a new item. And there I want to add the meal for that ID here. And of course I can find that meal on my state there on meals. This is this property. State here always refers just to this state structure here, by the way. And now here I can find the meal which I want to add. And since this gets very long, I'll actually outsource this into a new line. So my meal, which I want to add, can be found with the find method, which runs on all meals. And there, if meal ID is equal to action.mealID, then I have the meal I want to add. And it's this meal which I concatenate to my favorite meals so that I add this to that array. That should be logic that works and that manages our favorites. Now we need to make sure that we actually dispatch this action whenever we click that star icon in our header. To dispatch the action, let's go to the meal detail screen, because that's where we have our star icon here. And when I press this button, I in the end want to dispatch an action. Good news is dispatching actions is very easy. We got use selector. We also got use dispatch, which in the end gives us an easy way of firing a function. The bad news is that this, of course, can only be used in the component body here, in our functional component, and not in the navigation options. So we'll again have to work with set params to communicate between navigation options and the component. But that is something we can, of course, do. So here in meal detail screen, I'll simply start by calling use dispatch. And what this does is it gives us a dispatch function, a function we can call to dispatch new actions. And I'll store it in a constant named dispatch. Next, I want to create a toggle favorite handler, which is a function, which in the end should dispatch this action. So here I want to call dispatch, which I have available thanks to this hook. And now to dispatch, I need to forward the action which I want to dispatch. And for this, I'll use this action creator, toggle favorite here. So we just have to import this. Import from the store folder, there from actions, and there from the meals.js file. From there, I want to import toggle favorite. Not the identifier in all caps, but this action creator function. With that imported here in dispatch, we can call toggle favorite like this. And now here we need to forward the ID. And that, of course, is the meal ID, which we're already extracting up there. Or selected meal.id would also work, whatever you want. I'll simply go for the meal ID like this. Now we can reactivate useEffect to communicate to our header. Not with this line though, but instead with props, navigation, set params. And now here, I'll name this toggle fav, the name is up to you, and point at my toggle favorite handler. Now toggle favorite handler should therefore be added as a dependency here, and to avoid infinite loops, I'll again use callback, which I import from React, to wrap this function here. So here use callback is wrapped around this function, and we need to specify dependencies here. And dependency number 1 is dispatch. React Redux will make sure that this never changes though, so that's a dependency which will never change. Dependency 2 is meal ID, and that also shouldn't change whilst we're on this page. It will always have the same value. So with that, this function shouldn't really be recreated, which means this effect will never rerun unless it's recreated, which only is the case if we had a new ID, in which case it would be good that this is recreated, but otherwise this won't change. And hence we should have a secure communication channel here. Now in the header, we can now extract that handler. By the way, we also don't need the meal ID here anymore. We can now simply get the toggle favorite function out of our navigation data, navigation get param, and then I named that toggle fav, so that's the param name which we can extract, and this should give us access to this function which we pass. Now toggle favorite is what should actually be executed when we press this button. So here I will point at toggle favorite, because this holds a pointer at this function, and therefore this function will be executed when we now press this star. Well, we'll see if that works. Let's save that. And go back to the spaghetti here and click this star and click to favorites. And that looks good. Spaghetti are part of the favorites. Let's click the star again here and go to favorites, and it's gone. That makes a lot of sense. Click it again. It's back. Go to the detail page here in the favorites tab and click on the star and go back. Well, it's gone. Let's also verify it on Android for the schnitzel maybe. Favorites is empty right now. Let's go back and click the star. Go to favorites. Here it is. Go back, click the star, and it's gone. So this logic generally works. There are a couple of things I still want to work on. For example, I want to change the icon based on the favorite status. I also want to show some text in the favorite screen when it's empty. But generally, dispatching and using the data works, even if we need it in a header.